Okay, so let's talk editing for a moment. Now, I guess the best way to start is think about uh, uh, an analog keyboard, an analog synthesizer, and most of the ones that you can imagine from that you've probably seen from the 80s and ones that you've probably seen in the shops now, which are kind of like making comebacks, all um, have a control deck on the front of them with a whole bunch of control knobs, faders, and selection switches. And they all have labels over them, rather like this, actually tell you what they do. Forget all of that with this unit because it doesn't have any of that attached to it. Roland knew that, and the PG1 was what they had that plugged into this, which had all of those things on it, and it was the simple way of editing sounds because it had all of that in front of you and you could see it. But if you don't have one of those and you're not fortunate enough to have got one with your unit, then the only other way of editing is using the controller. And when you use it with the controller, the whole thing starts to become not a pleasure to create sounds, but becomes a headache and almost a nightmare to do. But in the same way, the unit divides it into control knobs, faders, and selection switches, on-off switches, just like you would on a keyboard, but in a bit of a different way. If I first hit this program button, you'll actually see that it comes up with this CF. Now this means cutoff filter if you're not aware of that. Now on your on the controller itself actually has three knobs, and if you look back at my previous episode, you'll see that essentially those knobs are cutoff, edit, and LFO mode. Now, the two that you need in usually using this one is really only the edit and the cutoff. Now, the cutoff knob actually just relates to this, and it just really just as a bit of it gives a, I suppose it's a pitch change in the sound, or a tonal change in the sound. So from a very sort of low kind of filter to a sort of a high end kind of sound, and it can make a kind of a dramatic change. The way it works, just to show you, and I can't show you on the controller at the same time, unfortunately, but if I turn that knob on my controller, you can see that it goes from 0, can go all the way up to 99. Now, I can do that on the fly at any time. As soon as I hit this edit button, and if I touch the knob, it jumps straight into edit mode. Now it starts at 1-1, so it's starting at being this a 4-voice synthesizer. This is starting at one of the first voices, and basically is the modes. Now 1-1, the way you change these, and I'll show you that in a minute. But you can see this is 1-1, and basically it's just going 1-1 with the pedal, and you come up with this mode, which is, I think it's called, and I need the manual to look at it. This is why you need a manual. 1-1 is the DCO mode, I think it is, from memory. Isn't that terrible? DCO. This is DCO range. So basically, it's a selector knob. So think of like a four position select knob, a selector control. So it would be like 1, 2, 3, 4, and so it selects a different mode. The other way is a bit like the cutoff. So you have that range. So for instance, the DCO tuning of it, so you can tune the actual DCO. Then the way to do that is, say, with this one, so it's 13, it's 1, 3. And I can then change the parameters again from 0 all the way through to 99. That's the way that tends to work. Now The other type of switch is like an on-off switch, or it's like a selector kind of switch, and that looks slightly different again. And in this one, it would be like a well, this one's like an envelope. This one's like an envelope selector. So it's 5-2, and you can see there. And if I use the edit switch again on my controller, you'll see it changes from up and down like that. There's also a free, so that was a 4 selector I showed you before, switch as well. There's actually also a 3 selector one. So this is chorus mode. So this is actually the chorus built into it, and that's 54. So I go 54, and you can see there's 3 modes for the chorus there, and each of those is slightly wider depth. Now, as you can tell, I'm not that very technical in terms of the unit itself. So without sort of like something to reference it with, I would be totally lost. But you can start to see how complex this unit starts to become. And at 47 parameter changes, and there's 47 of those types of things, it is so easy to get lost with your sound editing. And that's why I said this starts to become not a pleasant thing to do. It starts to become a nightmare. Make a couple of changes that changes your sound completely, and you can inevitably change the sound, and you can never come back to it. And you almost have to, well, you have to actually come back and start from the beginning, because there's no way that you can recover from some of the changes. It's that bad. And as you can sort of see, there is nothing that gives you any context without using the manual that tells you what it is you're actually editing, what parameter you're actually editing within those 47. So that's what makes this whole thing start to become really complicated, and why I said at the beginning, you need to be a rocket scientist, because it really is that bad. And it's certainly not something that you could kind of do at a gig, that you could kind of just go, oh, I'm going to change the sound. You certainly couldn't do that. You would need a night to kind of like to start doing that. Once you've actually got the sound, though, you can actually then come back out of program mode. You can hit that right mode, and as long as you've got it in you've got the protect switch off, you can actually then just assign that to the patch, and it will work just like you would with, say, any multi-effects unit. So that just gives you a very brief context of how that works. So look, I hope that gives you a little bit of a flavour of the complexity of the unit. It certainly was the downfall of it, and as you can see, without any context involved in it, the whole thing starts to become really hard. And instead of it being a fun thing to do, ends up being this real chore, and almost it's something that you end up putting away to the side, because you just can't bother trying to do any more with it. And certainly I think that was one of the problems with a lot of people, a lot of bass players and a lot of guitarists at the time who had the unit would essentially pick it up, play it, thinking that they could just easily get those sounds, and it ended up being a lot more complex than anyone thought it would be. And as I said, that was the downfall of the unit itself, is that complexity. If you like that sort of stuff, then you'll find it an interesting thing, and it is certainly still a great tool, and I like using it. But in terms of actually creating additional sounds, you need to almost set aside an afternoon to do that in an evening, because it just takes so much time to do. Now, one of my final words I'll say on the whole thing is that at the very beginning of all of this, in my first episode, I kind of alluded to the fact that at the time Roland only had really a couple of ideas of how you as a bass player would actually use this synth. They certainly had an idea of how guitarists would do it, and that was certainly already from the GR300 and the 500, The one before, yes, the 500. And so they already had an idea of how all of that would kind of work. But they really didn't have much of an idea as a bass player how that would work. And in that respect, I'm going to refer you to a clip which hopefully is on the side over here, and I'll try and put it in my channel as well if it's not already there, which comes back to some old footage from a BBC program called Rock School from the early 80s. And there's not many clips from Rock School, but the couple that are up there, one of them is actually related to guitar synths or synths at the time. And the piece, actually, which goes for about 10 minutes, is talking about the GR700 guitar synth, the GR77 bass, Sir Simmons drum kit, and a couple of keyboards. I think one of the keyboards is probably the JX3 or the JX8P. But the interesting thing was they talk about it as being basically the state of the art at the time. Now the spiel that they talk about with the bass is actually almost word for word what the spiel was at most of the music shows when they were kind of introducing the GR77B. And the two ideas were basically, one, you could pick you as a bass player would substitute your own bass sound for a synth sound, and substitute the bass line using a synth sound, and that kind of can work, and it can be quite funky, and you can sort of think back to sort of like the late 70s, early 80s kind of disco-y and those kind of things. And there is probably some scope for that. And in my second series at the beginning, you saw me doing a couple of things there as well. You can do that. The other way, though, which was probably the more bizarre way, is that in some respects they thought you as a bass player were sick of playing bass, and that you would want to change, that you would want to substitute yourself for another instrument. And in that regards, they sort of saw that somebody else in the band would pick up the bass role, using the guitar or using the keyboard. I think in the Rock School scenario, they actually used the keyboard player as the bass, as playing the bass, the bass line. But then you, as the bass player, would end up substituting yourself for something else and want to play, I don't know, a string sound, or you would want to play keyboard, or you would want to play something else. And that to me doesn't sort of tend to work. On the Rock School clip, they do it with great effect. It's quite funky, but it kind of makes it out to be a very sort of one-trick pony, and that's kind of where you sort of start to think, where you start to see that as being a fun party trick, but as an everyday instrument and something that you could gig with all the time, it starts to not be that viable. The other thing at the very end of it is actually a discussion they have with Midge Muir from Ultravox at the time, who was using guitar synths, and the discussion is not about how great the guitar synth was. It's actually how painful it is to use, and how it actually was, for them anyway, a one-trick pony, and how you couldn't use it for a lot of things because of just how hard it was to use and how it was hard to play in a live setting. So there's a few things there to think about. I might add one last episode to this, which gives you just a bit of an idea of how I've used the synth myself, and I've tended to adapt it to my own playing style and to my own kind of way of wanting to use it, and then in that respect I can tend to use it for a whole gig, not just as a couple of things, because the last thing you want to do is drag along that thing with all your other gear as well to some gig. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an idea, and I hope you've enjoyed that. As I said, if you've got any queries or you want to ask any other further questions, feel free to drop me something down the bottom there. Certainly I'd love to hear your own perspectives of that as well. Thanks also for subscribing to my channel. I've seen few of you guys now doing that. And thanks for all the good stuff you've been saying as well. I really appreciate it. Well, that's me for this episode. Keep a lookout for some other ones, and hopefully I will see you soon. Cheers.